Right now, very happy to have back on the show our friend Angelo Carusone, the president of Media Matters, a media watchdog organization that calls out right-wing media bias, which is everywhere. So he's here calling out water at this point, Angelo, calling out right-wing media bias. It is wherever you look. But thank you for coming on.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I talked about this yesterday on my show in detail, my open, and quoted Media Matters in that, and you guys did a great job in sadly having to watch Fox News, and that they literally, as of yesterday when the article came out, only covered Trump's dinner with bigots 7 minutes. 7 minutes. So first of all, taking a step back, does that indicate it's a corporate decision from on high, up top, and that's why that happens? Or is it just lucky happenstance that nobody wanted to cover it?
I think it's a little bit of both. What I would say is that right now, the reason why I'm comfortable saying it's a little bit of both is that, we've talked about this a bunch, but now it's actually happening. Fox Corporate has been delaying their contract renewals for quite some time during COVID. And they actually just did a meeting a few weeks ago where Lachlan Murdoch talked about how important this season is. They just started their fight right now with DirecTV for contract renewal. And all that's to say, they really need their audience to be not mad at them, because they actually need their audience to call companies and ask them to increase their bills. Right. So you don't get people to ask you to pay more money if you're mad at them. And so Fox is really sensitive to this idea about audience blowback and just keeping them really passionate. And when you talk about this stuff, they don't want to see it. The right wing doesn't want to see it. They don't want to hear, or they don't want to see it. They don't want to hear it. A large segment of their audience is sympathetic to the views of this. And they've gone out of their way already to sort of promote Ye, and and obviously they love to, they did all that editing with Kanye around his stuff. They've done a good job of what they always do, which is keeping their audience in a bubble, and they're not going to burst that bubble right now. There's too much money at stake. I mean, that's honestly the truth. So I feel comfortable saying there's a large corporate idea around it, which is that we're not going to go all the way in on this. And I think, by the way, that's further evidence that this whole narrative about how Fox is anti-Trump and it's all happening, it's people always overhype that a little bit too much. Because if there's ever a moment, right, this would have been it. I mean, there's not that much sympathy for Fuentes in the larger right-wing universe, but the audience is somewhat sympathetic here, and they love Trump, and they don't want to hear people ripping on him, and that's just it. And so it's a little bit of both, right? And because they know that when they write about it or talk about it, unless they're defending him, they're gonna get blowback from their audiences, and they're not willing to do that. And
isn't that really the real biggest bias in media that I see is story selection? It's not defending the indefensible. It's just don't cover it. We don't want to defend that, or don't cover things that are good for Democrats. Let's say if it's Fox News, is that where the ultimate bias will be, in that they're not spinning the story, they're just ignoring stories that are uncomfortable for them or they don't like?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that is, in this case, it's the agenda setting power that they have within the larger media landscape, but right-wing media, that Fox still has an enormous amount of agenda setting power, outsized agenda setting power. When you look at the crime coverage in the lead up to the midterms, there was this big spike that happened in late August and September, and there was about a 3-week lag, 2.5-week lag, and then all of a sudden CNN and MSNBC spike. And that's reflected then in the rest of the news coverage, right? Because if you're a reporter, or a contributor, you want to write more about this stuff in your online articles and your press articles, because that's going to get you on Morning Joe, and then you're going to, right? And so you start to respond to where the TV audience is, and that's largely a reflection of Fox's influence. And outside of their own bubble, within their own bubble, they have the same agenda setting power, which that when they don't talk about it, odds are their audience isn't exposed to it, and that and it cuts both ways, right? I mean, it's sort of this cruel twist. Trump deserves a lot of, we're seeing all these protests in China right now over, their zero COVID policy, their vaccine is terrible. Trump, to a large extent, in theory, should get a bunch of credit for the vaccine and support. But of course, Fox would never talk about that, right? Because their audience doesn't want to hear it. So the agenda setting power matters a lot. And that is the way that it's going to be, and probably the biggest influence in 2024 cycle is going to be in what they choose to talk about, and more importantly, what they choose not to address.
And also, I went through yesterday that Nick Fuentes has talked about, you can call me a Nazi, bigot, whatever you want, but you're not going to replace us. and his great replacement theory stuff. And I played clips cut together, I think it was from Media Matters, of Tucker Carlson talking about the great replacement theory. And you had Nick Fuentes defend January 6th. You had Tucker Carlson do a 3-part documentary defending January 6th. So how far different? I mean, I'm not kidding. I'm not. They are different. Okay. I'm not saying Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson are the same on every issue, but on main issues about white supremacy, downplaying January 6th, they're hand in hand. On anti-Semitism, I don't know where Tucker stands on it. I know that he cut out anti-Semitic stuff that Kanye had said instead of condemning them. So he's at least okay with it. But Nick Fuentes, and it would not be fair to say Nick Fuentes is just like Sean Hannity. They're different. But it is fair to say Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, they're fellow travelers in the same circle of bigotry. I mean, that really is the same audience.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the way that I draw the distinction is, obviously, I think that Tucker Carlson is a white supremacist, sure, but his programming. But again, you never know what's in someone's heart, right? You can only go by what they say. And his programming is without a doubt ethno-nationalist. And that is probably the biggest difference between him and Nick. And that's why they're sort of the same universe, which is that, Nick Fuentes is white nationalist all the way, which is that he really doesn't he wants white people in charge, white power. Like that is it. It's really a big part of it. There's no distinction. Tucker would say like with like. That's really the difference between ethno-nationalists, right, and white nationalists, is that white nationalists would want to subjugate a lot more. Tucker just wants them gone. And he really, and that is the truth. And if you think about it, I'm not trying to be controversial, but it's the truth. That whole argument about how diversity makes places weaker, it dilutes the ideas, it dilutes a culture. He's really big on ethno-nationalism. Now, I think he is a white supremacist. I think that at his core, he does believe that white people are superior, and there's plenty to back that up. But from a structural perspective and what his programming is oriented around, ethno-nationalism. And that means that when you think about ethno-nationalism, part of that is white genocide, is this idea that you're being replaced by a whole bunch of people of color, that standards are being lowered to privilege them, to advantage them, that there is a deliberate effort to do it. I don't think Carlson would say it's all the Jews. I think that he would say that it is, yes, it's Jewish people, but it's also other liberal elites and a bunch of these, right? He would say it's a larger tent that is engaging in this replacement, whereas Nick really just zeroes almost all of his animosity in on Jewish people. But that's why there is so much similarity and symmetry and parallels in what they argue, because, if you're thinking about it as two branches, their branches are basically identical. White ethno-nationalism and white nationalism are really similar up until a point. And at its core, that is what Tucker argues on a nightly basis, is genuinely ethno-nationalism. He really believes that. And that is where his rants about diversity come into play a lot. It wasn't just that, because he said it. He said, European immigrants make us stronger. Immigrants from South America and Mexico make us dirtier and poorer and dumber. I mean, this is what he said. I mean, that was like, when I remember when he said that years ago, people were shocked, as if it was like, how could someone say something so offensive? It's like, this is what Tucker has been pushing for years. So it's a weird thing to say that they're sort of cut from the same cloth, but they kind of are. And I know it's a hard leap to get there because it's like Tucker's so mainstream, but I think it's a genuine and a real observation. I think you're right.
Is there also an overlap in that certain Republicans, I mean, Trump, although now a few more have stepped up and condemned it, which it was a layup. It's so easy to condemn Nick Fuentes.
I know.
They don't bring up Kanye much, but they'll bring up Nick Fuentes, that kind of stuff. That's a layup. But Trump hasn't, Ron DeSantis hasn't. And for some of them, it seems like they understand their base more than others do. And not everyone in their base is a white supremacist, but there's enough there, you don't want to lose them. And same thing, Fox News, if they had segment after segment like CNN did and MS on this, it's going to be condemning them, not just Trump, but the philosophy, the ideology, the toxic ideology.
Correct.
And there has to be a swath of the Fox News viewership that is completely on board with white supremacy, like just vile anti-Semitism stuff.
Without a doubt. And I think it's important to know that one of Fox's mantras for years has been respect the audience. That is a thing that they repeat all the time at the corporate level. It's a big part of their programming DNA. And what that means, respect the audience, is, to your point, it means what you don't do is scold for viewpoints that our audiences may have that everybody else is scolding them for. Roger Ailes really put that into the lifeblood of Fox News. And his whole idea was that our audience is always being told that the things that they feel and believe are wrong, or mean, or hateful, or bigoted, and we're just not going to do that. We're not going to scold our audience. And that sort of programming philosophy and tone sort of worked its way into this mantra, which was respect the audience. And when Fox says that, which is a big part of that, like I said, it's a big part of their programming sort of orientation, it really means that, which is that, as to your point, it means that there are going to be people in our audience that are very sympathetic to this, even if they wouldn't identify as white supremacists or anti-Semites. And we're going to respect their viewpoint by not chastising, scolding, or doing something that could seemingly scold them, And it's like when there was about a decade ago, this guy, Cliven Bundy, he was a hero to them because he had been setting up this stand-up. And they pumped this guy up so much. Then a video came out of him basically saying all kinds of really offensive, like the N-word, it was bad. I mean, it was really bad.
Right.
They didn't condemn him. He just disappeared, right? And instead it became about the movement and the other people that were involved in the standoff. And it's the same thing. Why wouldn't they condemn the use of the N-word and his other bigoted rants? Because there was a large part of their audience that really loved him. And they loved him for that. And they knew it. And there's lots of these examples where they very purposely don't hit on some of these things because they know that they need to respect their audience. And so you're totally right.
It's very interesting to see these parallels. Chatting with Angelo Carusone from Media Matters, the head of it. So before we talk about Elon Musk, which is going to take up a chunk of time because of developments there.
Yeah.
Just from a media point of view, right now you've got Trump-loving future wife of Donald Trump, Carrie Lake, who's really auditioning to be wife number 4, I think, for Trump. And she lost in Arizona by 17,000 votes. And there's no path for her. It's not going to happen. But she's not getting on Fox. I guess they're not putting her on right now. But she's going on Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk and literally saying it's time to stand and fight. That's her exact words, to overturn the election laws, and calling on people to get arrested to stop the certification. And my question is the bigger picture here of, in this post-January 6th world, right now the national media is ignoring it. I understand why. But when is it dangerous to ignore it? Like, what happens? Donald Trump has sort of amplified some of the things, but the media is sort of ignoring a lot of Trump right now because he's posting so much garbage on Truth Social every day, like Twitter, and they're picking and choosing. So at what point does it become important that the media say, hey, what Carrie Lake is doing is very dangerous? Or the flip side is, are you helping her get her message out to people that you don't want to hear this message if they're not hearing it?
Yeah, I think it is very dangerous. And I think that there's one thing that's really clear. And that is that I can understand the argument for them not hyping this up and treating it and nationalizing this story because it is localized, and as you pointed out, it doesn't seem to be getting the kinds of traction that it could, right? And the uplift. But that said, what they're ignoring it shouldn't come at the cost of ignoring the larger point that you made, and that is that they still give national Republican leaders a pass, and that is that. So Kevin McCarthy never has to answer for Carrie Lake. Right? There's going to be a big fight between Ronna McDaniel and Lee Zeldin around who's going to become the new RNC.
My Pillow guy, right? And the My Pillow guy's in that fight.
And the My Pillow guy, I know. My
Pillow's for everybody.
And yet, and there's a lot of Schadenfreude, and they're all kind of laughing about My Pillow guy getting into the race, but they're not asking Lee Zeldin or Ronna McDaniel to explain or say something about Carrie Lake, right? And that's important because by giving leaders and national leaders a pass on what Carrie Lake is doing, they are creating, they're not creating any space between the Republican Party and this part of where the Republican Party gets their fringes. And that's where I think if you peel back that one layer, that's when you can start to expose whether or not it's actually a deeper national problem still, which I think it is. Because if they won't say the answer, then that tells you everything you need to know. Just like we were just talking about Fox, then they know where their base is. And that means that their base is primed and ready to go. And they just don't want to fight that fight in Arizona. But that means that they're still ready for the anti-democratic fights. If they are willing to condemn, that's important. That's good. Right. But the blowback from their base would be significant, right? So I think that's where I come down on it, which is that there hasn't been enough indicators to say, yeah, they should be hair on fire about this. The local news is doing a pretty good job covering her, but I do genuinely think they've dropped the ball entirely on asking Republican leaders to account for this, and they need to, because they hyped her so much. And
Yeah, she got a
and
lot
had
of
she
press.
won,
She got a
oh
ton
yeah,
of press.
she did. And I think that's where they really dropped the ball. And
That's a
you
good
know, because and I think it gets to the same story, but I think too often they do that. I promise you, if AOC was doing what Carrie Lake is doing on the election side, every Democrat, every person that was once a Democrat would be asked about this by anyone that has a microphone or a column. And they would never not be asked about it. It'd be asked in perpetuity, right? Because that is it's a muscle memory for the news media to ask Democrats to account for others, especially when there's some opportunity to create some what seems like a food fight. But they never ask Republican leaders to account for their people. And that is just like they never asked Kevin McCarthy to account for, Marjorie Taylor Greene and him got very close over the last year and a half. And they never asked him about her as they got closer and closer during the election, which they should have, right? And I think that's a problem. And I think that's where I come down, is that they should be asking Republican leaders and Republican commentators about Carrie Lake and what she's doing, and they're not. And that's the problem. I have my problem with them letting their leaders, because that means they benefit from this in a way. And it also doesn't expose the deeper underbelly here, which is that we're still on the knife's edge.
We are. And, a lot of times we're critical of the media because that's sort of the nature of this. If you're going to talk about the media, you're generally going to talk about issues you want them to do better. But there was something yesterday that was very good. Kevin McCarthy asked the press conference outside of the White House about Donald Trump. And he said Donald Trump denounced Nick Fuentes 4 times. And the reporter goes, no, he never denounced. He just said he didn't know it. And it wasn't confidential. It was much more matter of fact. And McCarthy said, oh, well, he didn't know him then, but like McCarthy was out there peddling water, lying
right.
Donald Trump. He literally was lying. He knew Donald Trump didn't announce it because everyone's talking about Donald Trump not denouncing it. So he was lying. Right. Maybe he thought he was not going to get fact checked, but he got fact checked in real time, which is so much important for journalists to do it because it's right there in the bite. It's not like in another medium, you got to go read about it. That journalist, I don't know who it was, unfortunately, but I love the way it was done. It wasn't computational, it was just matter of fact, no, he hasn't. He just said he didn't know him. So then McCarthy had to go like, oh, okay, well, I denounce him then, that kind of stuff. I'm like, you just got fact check in real time. I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. This is what journalism is.
So, and I think that's important, right? And when it works, it works. And it does, as you pointed out, it doesn't have to be the sort of like, you're not they don't have to be combatant. They're not a combatant. They're not a part of the story. And I think, as you pointed out, doing it in a way that is matter of fact and sort of very intentionally one layer removed. The fact that you didn't know who that is a great thing in a weird way, right? Because it lets the information stand on its own, and you don't have to then say, "Oh, I kind of hate that commentator." I hate that journalist. I hate that correspondent. They say 90% of the stuff they say is awful and irritating, and so I'm going to be less excited about promoting that. And it's a real thing when they make themselves a part of the story. And because it was Trump and so much of it, that there's a reason why White House correspondents tend to get bigger, more national gigs after they do their run as a White House correspondent, right? And it's increasingly become more of a show, especially during Trump, because you could use that as a launch pad for a show, because especially if you made yourself a part of the story. So yeah, I think that's important, and when it works, it works. And I think they do have a tendency to let some of these Republican leaders get a pass on some of these big things. So yeah.
Being a White House correspondence reporter when you're unknown is sort of like getting cast on Saturday Night Live when you're a young comic or performer.
Oh man,
it's your chance. It can work out really well and get your own show, or you can just fade into obscurity, which happens at SNL, and have some White House correspondents who end up, it doesn't work out for them the way they want to. But it's really interesting to see, because I'm much more aware of who are the White House correspondents and reading, like in the articles about this person. In fact, Phil Mattingly just became the chief White House correspondent. It was like a really young guy at CNN. And Caitlin Collins got moved up to be co-host of the morning show with Don Lemon. And so I don't know if you've watched that. How is that doing, by the way? I know you watch media a lot.
Not great.
Not yet.
It's not doing great. No, it's not doing great.
It'll take time. I mean, look,
it's not doing great.
I like Don. I used to go on his old show, not the night show, but even years ago when he did Saturday, I was on like every Saturday for a year. And I like Don a lot. I haven't talked to him in a few years, maybe in a year or so, but it takes time. And it's a weird, like, if you didn't like Don Lemon's political opinions at 10 p.m., why are you going to like him at 6 a.m.? It made no sense.
Yeah, no, I know. I thought they should have kept him in that slot. I think that they made a mistake by getting rid of him. I think that he was really good in that nighttime time slot. And I think that they're catering too much to right-wing blowback about, the right wing has picked their targets, right? And they have a tendency to do, they tried to get rid of Joy Reid, it didn't work, but they really kept coming for it. They tormented Melissa Harris Perry, was a fixture in right-wing media, and Don Lemon is too. I mean, they rip him, and obviously there's a through line there. There's a reason they are the most talked about people on Tucker, and I don't think it's because they're on the same channel, because they're not, right? It's like it's just one thing they have in common, and but he really does, and I think that's a part of it, is that CNN wants to appeal to a more conservative audience, because that's where they think that there's a bigger slice of the pie there. And because the right has decided that Don Lemon is too toxic, they and radioactive, and they made them radioactive for so many people. There are people that wouldn't even consider CNN until it felt like they had sort of diluted, sort of where Don was in the space. I just think their morning show it's gonna be hard. It's gonna be a grind for them. I think it's gonna take a really long time for them to actually get a program that makes sense. I don't think they're going to have anything this year, in any meaningful way. I think that, Joe Scarborough has really consumed so much of the mornings now for the audience that CNN could appeal to, like the political audience, watch Joe Scarborough's show. But I think that's a mistake sometimes, but I think it's just too much Joe Scarborough in the morning. And I think they're probably oversaturating him, but yeah, I think CNN's really struggling, and ultimately, I think they made a big mistake diluting Don. Remember, there's some famous moments from Don Lemon's show during the last presidential cycle. A lot of famous moments, like the "who's doing the raping" comment that Trump made. That was on his show, and you could go back.
About she was bleeding from somewhere.
That's exactly right. There's so many, and it wasn't just Trump either. There were other major fights that happened on his show at night too. There were flashpoints during the last presidential, and during 16, and also 20. So I think they've discounted, for this window we're in this weird lull between presidentials, they've actually discounted something, that he was a pretty big newsmaker at night, probably one of the bigger newsmakers at night, compared to some others. And that meant that he had rollover into the next day. And I'm not trying to show for him, it's just, I don't think he got enough credit for that from CNN, in terms of, I think one of the benefits of the format that he did was it created a weird space where some of these individuals had their guard down. And because he was functionally live later than others, it made a difference, I think, for CNN. I think they lost a little bit of their edge here.
Well, we'll see. I mean, earlier today, we saw reports that CNN's going to have a decent number of layoffs of on-air contributors and then behind the scenes people. And we'll see. We don't know who they're laying off. We don't know how it's going to impact the content, but I know everyone's going to be watching carefully to see does it really swing to the right? And I don't think it's going to swing to the right, like not even close to Fox News, but their idea of balance concerns me. But we'll see, and time will tell. And, so I'm talking with Angelo Carusone. So Angelo, all right, before, let's take a break before we come back and talk about Elon Musk, because there's so much to talk about with Elon Musk, and that politically, why it matters, societally, why it matters, what's going on there. And could he be any more of an asshole? I mean, seriously, like, this is just not a good person. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back with our friend Angelo Carusone right after this. All right, you ready? Come right back.
Mm-hmm.
And welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. We're live here November 30th. Continue our conversation with Angelo Carusone, the president of Media Matters. So Angelo, Elon Musk, and again, for people not on Twitter, don't change the channel, because it actually matters. It matters so far beyond Twitter, what Elon Musk is now doing. In the beginning, maybe you could have said it was just Twitter, blah, blah, blah. It's societal. He's contributing, and I'm really concerned he's unleashing the toxic element that Twitter was trying to hem in. Because at one point, to remind people, if you weren't on Twitter, there were times years ago, Twitter was a cesspool.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, Facebook was like going to P.F. Chang's. It was like kind of nice. You hang out. Every now and then someone says something snarky, no big deal. Twitter was Dodge City. You go on, and it was Fight Club. And I actually engaged like with Andrew England. It was him himself, like the Daily Stormer, neo-not. Like, well, you're dealing with really vile, despicable people who were there. And they were there being themselves. And they would engage you. If you want to engage with them, they were. And I'm like, I'm not sure about this. Like, and then it got really ugly. And then there was a point where the Twitter people go like, we don't want this. We want to be a platform for ideas, and especially journalists and political people to stay on here, because political people are not going to stay on when it really becomes a white supremacist haven. And now it seems like Elon Musk is really hell-bent on returning it to the early Twitter, which was really vile, very, very dangerous, very, very toxic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he is the thing to keep in mind about Elon Musk is that he is fully red-pilled and he's a convert. And converts are always the most fanatical, And so one is that he really has bought into this idea that the social media platforms are reflexively liberal, or had been, and that there needs to be one that is not going to explicitly cater to the left. And in a way, he sees Twitter sort of filling that role. So for him, the fight is so much bigger than Twitter. He wants to use Twitter as a mechanism to push back against the larger online information landscape. So he's willing to go even further because of what he's trying to demonstrate. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that, he doesn't understand enough or really thought through all the implications of which we're seeing this play out in real time with this verification thing, right? Which is that it's so obvious that he didn't really sit down and really think through why you have certain policies and then how you go about, when you think about what's against the rules, there's a couple ways here, right? It's like, what is our rule? What's our policy? What are we going to allow? What are we not going to allow? And then the second part of that, though, is how are we going to detect it? It's not all people reporting stuff. A lot of this stuff is, how are we going to detect or determine that these things are happening? And then third is, what's the punishment scheme? Is it a suspension? Is it delete a tweet? Is it ban your account? Whatever that is. How are we going to decide the enforcement framework? And for him, obviously, these things are iterative. They constantly adapt and change. That's why advocates who care about this work in the disinformation space were focused on these platforms for a while, because they needed to put in place improvements. And in some cases, it could be really significant. Like in 2019, to your point about it being no man, just like open, just an open space, Twitter, no social media company had a policy dealing with deep fakes. So you could go onto a platform, publish a total deep fake, and it would be fine, including around an election, right? You could do anything. And that matters. So in 2019, when platforms were engaged on this, it was Twitter that was the first one that said, you know what, we're going to prohibit the use of deep fakes on our platform without a clear, identification. And we're going to invest in the resources to detect them, and then we'll take them down. All the other platforms followed suit. Think about how much more complicated the last election cycle would have been, right? Imagine the deep fakes about Hunter Biden in October of 2020, right? People never stopped talking about that New York Post article, but could you imagine if the social media companies had not done what they did in 2019 around deep fakes, and all of the Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon claims about Hunter Biden were actually short video vignettes that were circulating everywhere? It would have been 2016 all over again, right? In terms of just the disinformation landscape. So I would say that the big picture is that the enforcement framework works, and Musk he never spent the time to learn about it. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that he does have a real clear ideological agenda. So my big emphasis on this is that it doesn't matter if people use Twitter, care about Twitter, it's fine. If they don't, the effect here, just like Fox News, if you never watch it, can still affect what you see on CNN and MSNBC and elsewhere. It's the same thing here. What Twitter can do is affect how other platforms deal with the space. But then more importantly, and you sort of got into this a little bit, which is that if you let back on all these accounts and create a safe space and a haven for these extremists to organize and operate, it's not just that you're giving them that space, it's that the algorithm is so powerful and so potent, you can help connect and grow these movements. Right now, they're kind of isolated to these one-offs, right? They have on Telegram, there's no algorithm on these chat groups. You have to invite people, you have to find them yourself. What if when Twitter starts to recommend you to different groups and you to different individuals, the more extreme the platform becomes, the more lookalikes there are, the more the platform starts to tilt. And that means that it becomes not just a haven for extremism and disinformation, but it actually becomes an engine of radicalization. And that's where it really starts to spill over. And so, it's not just people saying mean things and us saying, oh, we should care about Elon Musk using this platform to hurt people's feelings. No, it's much more dangerous than that. And it does make a difference. When the troll and bot farms were deployed in 2016, that had devastating effects. That was Twitter. Facebook a little bit, but Twitter too. And so it does affect all of us. And Musk has a pretty clear agenda right now to essentially strip it down to nothing but a free for all. He really just doesn't want to have any rules. And real individuals will be harmed at a one-to-one level. But then system-wise, we're all going to be affected by this, even if we quit.
I think it's a great analogy you make, that even though most people listening don't watch Fox News still impacts our lives if you're involved in politics. We all know that. So even if you're not on Twitter, it spills out into the real world. it's because of our discussions in the past that I think I understand what Elon Musk is doing with the subscription fee, because we talked about this with Fox News. Fox News is just about advertiser boycotts, because each of us as cable news is paying $2 to $3 in our bill that goes right to Fox News. So advertiser boycotts don't matter to them. And I think twofold for Elon Musk, I think he understood that. He's losing advertisers. So if he's going to let these white supremacists back on, the literally neo-Nazis back on, and he's going to lose more advertisers, the only way to get rid of the deficit, I understand it's a daily deficit, that is to have enough subscribers that you don't care anymore, like Fox News. I don't see the numbers being there, because it's not like an internet fee. It's more like my internet provider charging me 50 cents more, and they get it from everyone. This is voluntarily. I'll never give the guy a penny. Now, he can take my blue check. I don't care. I will never support him by giving money. And I debate staying on the platform or not, but for now I'm staying there with the good people that are left, so we can be a community and network till we find another place to do it. But do you think that the business model of Fox News is why he's doing the subscription fee?
It's exactly, you want that guaranteed revenue, because that makes you less immune to commercial pressures. And that is the defining characteristic of this. And I think a lot of what he's doing is parallels to the modern, in the way that Fox News was born. When Fox News was born in the late 90s, and in fact, DirecTV had just said this about Fox. They attacked Fox News in the last couple of days because they're in a dispute, which if you have DirecTV, you should call them and tell them not to, no Fox fee. They've been doing a good job so far fighting it. But they said that, Fox had refined this model of forcing cable companies to pay them more money to support their larger agenda. It's the same thing here, which is that they realized, as time went on with Fox, in order to really to respect their audience in the way they wanted to respect them, the types of content they wanted to produce were not going to be fully commercially viable. And so they needed an alternative guaranteed revenue stream, which is what these cable contracts are. And that's sort of Musk's theory, which is that enough people want to own the libs that they will pay a premium for not just the blue check mark, but also to be at the top of replies and responses, which is one of the other benefits you get. And that, you can basically grow the user base enough to then attract some direct response advertisers, which is I think part of his theory, which is how right-wing talk radio works, is direct response advertising. And then the other thing is that you get some guaranteed revenue, and then you work within those confines. And he is really trying to make a shift to this subscription model. The third bucket will be in the form of taking a little off the top for paid, reading news articles. He'll take ask people to chart. He'll develop a subscription model, for 5 cents a read of a publication. And then maybe to take a little off the top of a payment processing service, which I think is inevitable. He sort of teased this, and I think that he thinks that you can have enough guaranteed revenue between his subscriptions and these other two pieces that he wouldn't need to worry about advertising. But honestly, the market's not there, the industry's not there, and he knows that. So the dirty secret is, in order for him to really make any money, he'd have to do something that Twitter currently doesn't do, which is sell data at scale.
Sell data about the users?
That's right. Because Twitter has a lot of data on you. Twitter knows Twitter knows when you slow down on your scroll. So it knows what types of things get your attention longer when you reread stuff, when you click on it. It knows where you stop. It knows the types of things that grab you. It collects all that and builds a profile. It knows what else you're doing when you're using Twitter on your phone. It knows if you're doing it when you're working, if you're on Gmail. It knows if you're spending more time in iMessage. It knows what other applications you're spending more time in. And it also knows where you are geographically. It knows if you're using it predominantly at home, dual screening, which was one of the revolutionaries of the Obama campaign, is that they developed targeting for dual screening for people to be able for them to communicate with people while they were watching TV and using their cell phone at the same time. And it was a really sophisticated form of advertising that allowed for way more precise communication. They weren't doing something duplicitous with Twitter, but it was a really smart way of hitting people twice so that you could really reinforce your message to them. And that was a decade ago. So my only point is that and this I think is the part that's kind of unsettling about it, if you really want to make Twitter profitable, as you pointed out, there will not be enough guaranteed revenue from those other streams. What he will ultimately need to do is sell the data. There is no other way for him to, either he sells it to advertisers, the ability to speak to people with snippets of the data, or he sells the data in raw forms for larger purposes. And that's the only other way he could even come close to making enough money to break even. Otherwise, he's going to be putting a lot of money into the platform for a while, and maybe he's comfortable doing that for a period of time. The operating costs are a few $1 billion a year. He's pretty wealthy and can keep borrowing money to pay that. But yeah, that's it. That's where it's at. And I think he has a video plan and some streaming, but it's a real concern. And I think, yeah.
I guess the other alternative is develop content that's unique to Twitter if people want to subscribe to it, like an Amazon Prime or Netflix does, that kind of stuff. I don't know if he'll do that. By the way, what would hold him back from selling the data now? Is there a reason? You're saying that Twitter doesn't do this. They don't sell that data.
They don't really sell the data. It's legally murky. As you point, we were talking about earlier for the show, like the European Union already warned him today about the rules around the platform. The app stores would consider that to be a violation of the use. Remember there was that big controversy with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, right? And it was and part of the controversy was not that Facebook had the data. No one ever said Facebook shouldn't have had the data, right? The argument was that Cambridge Analytica got the data that they shouldn't have got access to. It's the same thing. It's no, everybody knows these platforms have the data to an extent. The question is what they're able to then do with it, how they structure it, organize it, and repurpose it. It's murky, and this is where his fight with Apple comes in, right? It's that part of it is trying to squeeze Apple for a better deal, so he's getting less off the top, right? So they want 30% of the sales for Twitter Blue. He doesn't want to pay that, so that's where part of the fight is. But part of it is that if you work the refs at the app stores enough, you could push the boundaries so that they don't take away your device, your app from the app store, and that's it's a real thing. Fox Nation didn't get on Roku when they launched for almost a year because they couldn't meet the technical requirements. It's and technical requirements were, some of it was around basic broadcast capability, some of it was around data protection, and they didn't meet Roku's data. Well, because if you're Fox News, you're much more like a lifestyle brand than just a news agency, right? So they really collect a lot of information about their people for Fox Nation. There was issues with Roku around that. So it's fascinating that, to your point, the large thing that's limiting him here is one of the things that we're seeing spill over a little bit in the public, which is this fight with Apple and the app stores, which is that in his mind, they just have too much leverage and too much power, not just on the money front, but also because they get to determine what a lot of these applications do with the data that they collect as a result of being connected to this ecosystem.
And you mentioned the EU, the European Union today threatened Musk with potentially banning the app from being able to be used in Twitter, for the platform from being used in Twitter. And they have things like ditching an arbitrary approach to reinstating banned users, pursuing disinformation aggressively, that kind of stuff. Do you think it's a real threat? They have different laws, obviously, as people understand. And they apparently passed a new Digital Services Act, a landmark law that they say sets new standards for big tech and how they police content. So it seems like they're trying to flex their muscle to see what they can use. But what do you think really happens there with the EU?
Yeah, look, I'm going to be honest here. I'm really mad about this because back in May, Elon met with their head of this agency that issued this warning today, this Breton guy, and they did his big buddy picture, and Breton posted it on his Twitter feed about, hey, I'm with Elon Musk, and we reached an agreement, and he's promised that he's going to follow all of our rules. Now, if you keep in mind, back in May when Elon Musk did this, it really mattered because the board of Twitter still hadn't voted, the shareholders still hadn't voted on this. Right. There was still maneuvering happening at the board level. He was trying to get investors. It was important, and he went and got the blessing of the EU leader, saying, yeah, I feel very good about what he's going to do. And yet there was all the evidence to show everything that he said contradicted their rules, right? He endorsed Musk for buying the platform. That everything could have been different if this guy didn't get out there and say, hey, we can do it. What would have happened at the Twitter shareholder meetings at the board level in that moment, where if EU's industry chief said the stuff that he said he's going to do is going to violate our standards, the platform will no longer be allowed in the EU. But he didn't say it. Instead, he thought, like a lot of people, that you could maybe Elon, he's a genius, he's this great businessman. I think that this is an appropriate thing for them to take action to take today, but I really want to emphasize how much they messed up back in May, specifically this guy, because he endorsed Elon Musk acquisition. He endorsed it and announced that they reached an agreement. And he blessed it. And like the reason Musk went to him back then was because he knew it was a condition of getting through the approvals process. So I don't understand how and in what planet that at the moment where they had the leverage and it would have mattered, he could have done it and they didn't. Instead, it was the opposite. They helped bring us here. And yet now they're issuing this warning, and nothing about what Elon Musk he said he's going to do is different between now and April of earlier of this year. So I'm glad they said it. It's a big deal. I bet they'll follow through with it. But boy, am I mad. And I feel like everyone should be furious at this guy, because no one, I think, did more damage outside of Jack Dorsey to bless Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter than this guy, Thierry Breton.
I'm chatting with the infuriated Angelo Carusone. Angelo, who's more of a threat to our democracy, Rupert Murdoch or Elon Musk?
Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch?
Yeah, I still think so. And it's tough. I would say that, if Rupert Murdoch is the chief misinformer, whereas Elon Musk is like the chief misinformed, right? Which isn't to say that he's not a bad guy or doesn't have a lot of destructive potential, but there are limits to Twitter. We've seen that with the Biden campaign. They didn't run their entire campaign on Twitter, right? And they had everyone was mad, but like there is a limit to how much it can do. And there are other checks on the other platforms. And I think the way that the advertisers responded to Twitter limits how worse the other platforms can get. I don't think there is a single more destructive force than the Murdochs, because what they basically do is pave the way for the agenda setting power that we talked about earlier. Look what they're doing in Australia. They're suing that Crikey publication, which is one of the few non-Murdoch owned publications out there, because they said one thing about January 6th and said that Lachlan Murdoch was a functional co-conspirator. The free speech people are trying to put a publication, one of the only ones they don't own in Australia, out of business. Like, he's a threat to free speech. He's a threat to democracy. He's going to be a huge player in who decides who the next president is. And I think the climate change, there's just so many things you can go down. The damage to the LGBT community. I don't think quite yet there's a more destructive force. And I would say that in terms of acquisitions, I still think that Rupert Murdoch is going to go for his white whale and buy CNN. So I remain deeply, deeply terrified of that being a very real prospect. And the more that CNN chips away and moves into this posture, I think the more vulnerable they become, and the more likely it is that Rupert Murdoch makes his last run at it.
Musk is the mini-me of Murdoch, but right now, in the words of Angelo Carusone, that Rupert Murdoch and the Murdoch family, they have more influence right now, and they might be the most influential family in terms of media, and it's just remarkable in America.
Without a doubt.
So I had a couple other things. I'm not sure. Let me ask you this one, because no one's talked about this yet. The January 6th report has to come out before January 3rd. That's when the new Congress gets sworn in. How late in the cycle of the media world is it to drop this like Christmas Eve? Do they got to get this done? Because they're still taking interviews, which is great. And I wish Democrats had held the House and it wouldn't be a rush, but they have to deliver this. If you want media to actually cover this robustly, do you wait to January 2nd and do it the last day, like we're out of the holidays? Do you drop it in the middle of budget negotiation? You might be facing a shutdown with debt ceiling fight that's going to happen in mid-December. I think the 16th or 17th is our deadline for that.
Yep.
What do you do? If you were ever talking to Democrats now, January 6th committee, when would you tell them to drop this for the most potential press coverage?
They must have fired that consultant that had done a pretty good job at orchestrating the hearings, because they definitely missed the media cycle on this one. Right. I think that's a frustration. I don't care how good the report is. It will never now satisfy the expectations that they built. There'll be no ability to operationalize it in any meaningful way. And as you point out, so that's not to diminish it, but then what matters then is maximizing the media coverage of it, because you want to have as much uplift and saturation. So I'm reinforcing your point, not diminishing it. And I think that to that end, the timing probably would have been this month. Yeah, after the election. Right after the election, when you can contrast the two and really end it. And early December, but like it's the holidays, they call it a dead week. They called the period of time between Christmas and the New Year the dead week. Like in the news cycle, it's called the dead week. It's most places, the bulk of their content is written in advance. and they
Go
publish
away.
it on, it go away. No one's engaged. No one's around. Like, so I don't think they should drop it then. I think what they probably could do is drop it right, like you just pointed out, right at the beginning
January
of January.
2nd, but they, yeah.
That's it. And then hope that starts the conversation for the next Congress. And maybe that's a part of it. But then you have entirely new leadership. Is this what the new minority leader is going to want in, the new Democratic minority leader is going to want? Is this what Jeffries is going to want to start his the conversation about? Is it something that happened in the last Congress? I don't know. And if he's not bought in on this, then it's going to be a lot harder for them to get the kinds of congressional support that churns that part of the news cycle. So at minimum, the beginning of December was probably their last window, the first week, certainly before the 10th. And I think they're probably running out of time.
I'm going away the week of the 12th, so we know that's when it's going to get dropped. When I'm
I was
away.
going to say, that's it. You set the date.
Whenever
it's
I
your
go away.
vacation.
But you know what? Just to, brainstorming it here, January 2nd, because by law, Congress gets sworn in January 3rd, might be the best time. And because then, because the minute Republicans get control, day one's Hunter Biden, and have the media going, well, aren't you going to continue investigation to look what they found? Why aren't you talking about this? And let Republicans maybe get on the defensive, because you're right. They should not drop it. What's the latest? Last thing. What's the latest? They should drop it in December if they're going to drop it in December and try to get media coverage. The 10th, you're saying, or 8th?
I think the 10th is the safe day. I think the 14th is really close. It cuts into too much other stuff. The 10th, certainly before the 12th, would be the last drop dead date. Yeah.
Right when I'm getting on my plane. Perfect.
Yeah. The 12th is right before. But look, I think it's going to be tough. I mean, look, I think it's important to keep in mind that the Mueller investigation led to 34, some type of like indictments, right? I mean, it was a huge number. This isn't going to have anything close to that, right? And yet, if you think about the way the news media dealt with the aftermath of that, I don't think most people know how many dozens of people were indicted as a result of what Mueller did, right? I mean, it's considered a flop in some ways, and yet there was real consequence that came out of that. So that's the other thing that they're up against, right? Is that this thing is so hyped that whatever they produce is going to have to be so clear cut and concrete that it gives the media something to run with themselves. So to your point, they don't get it early enough to have a big shock to the system before the holidays. Then hopefully there's something in there that they push right before the start of the new Congress. So
that might be the best thing. Well, Angelo, thanks so much for spending so much time.
Thank you.
With us.
No,
Read Media Matters, folks. Great stuff on the media there. I go to it every day. Have a great day, my friend. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, you too. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.